Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 11 from The Orb, featuring Lee Scratch Perry, the Orbserver in the Star House. Alright, I've taken a while on this one, but it's finally time to get to the last mainline Orb album that I haven't already done a video on. Still got a odds and ends, top 10 and a worst to best ranking before the series is officially done, though. Now, when I reviewed their previous album, Metallic Spheres, with David Gilmour, I did mention that Patterson has gone on record saying that Pink Floyd wasn't as much of a big influence on the Orb's music as most people make it out to be, and that a lot of people's comparisons were really surface level, and I can believe that to some extent. Certainly their collab was a pretty big outlier in the Orb's catalog and Gilmour's catalog in terms of the overall sound. It didn't feel like Patterson and company getting to work with a huge personal hero, internally worshipping him and letting Gilmour take most of the reins. It felt much more of a proper collaboration of the two, where Gilmour was almost being treated as a new temporary member of the Orb and adding his own completely different flavor to that album. Now, if you wanted a project where it feels like Patterson was getting the opportunity to work with one of his biggest personal heroes, I suspect this project was a lot more of an exciting prospect for him personally. The influence of dub and reggae music has long loomed over the Orb's entire catalog since the very beginning. It's always been a way more obvious influence than Pink Floyd ever was. Ever since making a 15-minute straight dub reggae cut called Towers of Dub, and directly sampling Lee Scratch Perry's Blackboard Jungle on the cut Outlands. The fact that Patterson wanted to do an entire album with the artist most commonly credited with having invented dub music in the first place is one of the least surprising things ever. And bringing in Fellman for co-production, while a bit of an odd choice at first given his tendencies towards minimal techno formulas, also makes perfect sense given Fellman's co-production credits on Towers of Dub and Outlands. Dub music clearly means a lot to him as well, and getting to work with Perry was likely just as much of a dream come true for Fellman as it was for Patterson. There are lots of ways to describe the Orbserver in the Star House, but I don't think anyone can possibly call it inauthentic or disrespectful. Everyone involved clearly cared very deeply about what they were making and its ties to its roots in Jamaican culture. The trouble comes when you get to the music itself and realize the final effect isn't that interesting. See, the obvious downside to bringing in Fellman for co-production is that he does have a particularly minimalistic approach to his production. He has been responsible for pretty much all of the Orb's least interesting material over the years. And in comparison to the rest of the Orb's catalog, this does come off weirdly dry and listless. Now, I do think it does help to look at this album in the grander scheme of Lee Perry's catalog. After his unfortunate passing last year, I took it upon myself to sample through more of his music, and I was struck by how this album does sound different from what I've heard of Perry's other albums. I listened to a couple of his classic pioneering material in the 70s with The Upsetters, like Super Ape, Blackboard Jungle, and Return of the Super Ape. I checked out a few of his solo albums like Roast Fish, Collyweed, and Cornbread. I sampled through maybe a few of his later projects like Jamaican E.T. in 2002 or Heavy Rain from 2019, among others. I obviously can't pretend like I've heard enough of his massive, decades-long, hyper-prolific catalog to make a coherent blanket statement on his style, but I think it's pretty safe to say that the majority of his stuff was dub reggae music at its core. And while he would frequently dip into stranger or experimental territory, he rarely seems to have focused much on overtly electronic aesthetics or styles. I even checked out an album he did with Mad Professor in 2000 called Techno Party, but even that turned out to be a lot less electronic than that title promised. Any techno elements were limited to a few standard breakbeats here and there while focusing a lot more on traditional reggae sounds and formulas. In that particular way, the Orbserver in the Star House stuck out more to me from these other projects because it has a lot more of an overtly electronic aesthetic to its sound thanks to Fellman's typically stiff, minimal techno-influenced production style. That does probably make it more of a point of interest in Perry's catalog than it does in the Orb's catalog. By the Orb standards, it feels more like they're trying their best to make a Lee Perry album and not focusing as much on what makes them so unique as artists and producers. But by Perry standards, it's just another interesting collab with different producers that happens to add a different flavor to his sound that still fits him well. If Perry had handled any bit of the actual production on the album himself, it would make more sense to just bill it as Lee Scratch Perry featuring the Orb rather than the other way around. Instead, Perry just contributed his own improvised vocal performances over the Orb's original instrumentals. And it feels like both he and the Orb were just treating this as a quick bit of fun on the side. There's barely anything to analyze or break down here, really. It almost seems as if the entire thing were just thrown together on the fly, and most of it kind of runs together. Though, on the other hand, that may have been the exact effect they were going for, as if the 11 tracks on here just add up to one big cohesive experience. The dub grooves are all pretty solid for what they are, and Perry's vocals do add plenty of unique personality without ever feeling cheesy. There's no tracks here that fall flat or make me feel the urge to just skip over them. But there's also no moments here that would rank among my favorites the Orb have ever put out. Not to say there aren't a few standouts here. The opener, Ball of Fire, was the clear highlight for me, with Perry's toasting going over some stodgy synth patterns that managed to feel both stiffly danceable while also loose and laid back at the same time. Probably just straight up the best groove here. And cuts like H.O.O, Man in the Moon, and Soul Man seem to directly continue the grooves of their surrounding tracks with some slight variety in texture and tempo. There are a few cuts that have a bit more pronounced groove and texture, like Hold Me Upsetter and Thirsty, adding some stronger beats or maybe some horns. They tend to stick out to me a little more. And the closer, Congo, with its African rhythms and percussion, sticks out as a pretty interesting moment as well. And there are also two sort of cover songs here. One of them is a remake of Junior Murvin's Police and Thieves, which Perry co-wrote the original of. It's nice for a bit of still relevant political edge, and honestly, before this album was released, I didn't realize that this wasn't a Clash song. And the other cover is a highly dubified remix of Little Fluffy Clouds, retitled Golden Clouds, which perhaps unsurprisingly is one of the most striking sounding cuts just thanks to its reprisal of the Steve Reich samples and thicker and more dynamic bass lines. But that's about all I have to break down. All of it is fine, but I wouldn't say any of it is especially attention-grabbing. It's also worth noting that they did also release an entire B-Sides companion album to this one called More Tales from the Observatory, which does surprisingly feel like a worthwhile expansion on the ideas explored on the main album. There are cuts here that fall a lot more towards Fellman's typical sleeker, minimal dub techno formulas and probably would have stood out more in the original album's track listing. And there are a few cuts like No Ice Age and Don't Rush 1, which have a bit more texture to them as if to feel like a modernized take on some of Perry's 70s work. And there's instrumental versions included of all those tracks, which are neat too. This little comp might even be a tiny bit more enjoyable than the main album. It's pretty nice. And on top of that, they also released an entire instrumental and remix companion compilation, Observing the Storehouse in dub. Though I will say, this one can be skipped, as the instrumentals from the original album feel like they lose most of their soul once you take Perry's vocals out of the equation. The B-sides on More Tales had more interesting instrumentals that could stand on their own better. But yeah, I think that's everything there is to say about the Orbserver in the Starhouse. I can't bring myself to call it my least favorite Orb project overall, especially after Perry's passing. It did get a bit of an emotional boost in retrospect. But this is almost certainly the Orb project I put on the least frequently. This album is definitely much more consistent and respectable and well executed than Bicycles and Tricycles or Baghdad Batteries. In spite of the dryness of these compositions, I do feel like both Patterson and Fellman cared about what they were doing here more than they did on those two albums, and the fact that they got to work directly with Perry probably means a lot more to them personally. But both of those less consistent albums, in spite of having much lower low points, also have higher high points. I'd more likely see myself getting in the mood to put on a track like The Land of Green Ginger or Suburban Smog than I would for cuts like Golden Clouds and Ball of Fire. This album is quite nice. I do enjoy myself anytime I put it on. I think Perry and the Orb styles are easily compatible and work off each other well, but it's still mostly a side curiosity in their catalog more than anything else. And how much you get into it depends on how much of a taste you have for straight dub reggae. I can have space in my life for that occasionally, but I wouldn't say this is anything you absolutely need to go out of your way for, so I'm overall feeling a 6.7 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
Blue space, white clouds.